AMD's 9070 XT and 9070 cards have finally been released, and the reception has been overall positive, both from reviewers and from gamers. Well, at least from gamers who typically buy AMD. However, there are several things in this launch that don't add up, from performance to pricing, and especially to AMD's positioning of these cards. I think you'll find that buying a 9070 XT is not in your best interest. Let me explain, but before that, a word from today's sponsor. URCDkeys.com are having a March Super Sale, giving you access to Windows 11 Pro keys and Office keys for a super affordable price. If you buy a Windows key directly from Microsoft, you'll pay around $150 depending on your region, and that's for a home edition license. But if you buy an OEM key from URCDkeys.com, you will only have to pay $21.86 at the time of making this video, if you use my coupon code C25, and that's for Windows 11 Pro. These keys work globally and you'll get them within minutes. You can pay with a credit card or with PayPal. After purchasing, go to your purchased orders page and copy the key, and then on your Windows 11 install, type in the search activate and enter your key in the appropriate field and click activate. That's it, your Windows is activated and you can change your wallpaper and customize Windows and all that. You can also get Office 2021 Professional Plus at less than half the price with my coupon code C25. Check the links in the video description for your cheap OEM Windows keys today. Firstly, as revealed by Hardware Unboxed, the real MSRP of the 9070 XT is $650 and not $600 as AMD claims, seeing as Hardware Unboxed have gathered information from retailers that state that AMD is allegedly offering a $50 temporary rebate so that a few models do indeed show up at MSRP prices, but this is just a red herring to ensure that a few cards are listed at MSRP but not necessarily sold at MSRP, especially after the media review period is over. Not only will this result in a minuscule amount of cards available at MSRP, if any, but remember that this rebate is temporary. Videocards.com also published a statement from a Swedish retailer that confirms that the MSRPs only apply to the first shipment of cards that retailers received. From what was implied, it seems that board partners are selling the cards to retailers at higher prices than they typically would, which in turn means that AMD is selling the cards to board partners at prices that cannot meet the MSRP. If true, AMD is basically ensuring the MSRP appears initially to be encouraged, but in reality they are aiming for these cards to be sold at a minimum of $650. Looking at listings on launch day, all the cards I found at MSRP were immediately listed as being sold out. My local retailers listed the MSRP cards as out of stock immediately at launch embargo, with only cards from €700 to €1,100 being listed as in stock, and this is the case with e-tailers throughout the EU region. The same is true for Newegg in North America, where only cards above $750 seem to be in stock, and that won't last long, I'm sure. Most reviewers were baffled as to how the 9070 non-XT was only $50 cheaper than the 9070 XT, considering the non-XT performs a whole tier below the XT. But now we know that the real price difference between AMD's two cards is effectively $100, seeing that it was always AMD's intention to have the 9070 XT on sale starting at $650, not $600. Beyond pricing, there's also the matter of actual raster performance. I had estimated in past videos that the 9070 XT would be very close to the 7900 XTX, and reviews like the one from Tech Power Up showed that to be indeed the case, where we see the relative performance at 1080p and 1440p, showing the 9070 XT at just 2 to 3% slower than the 7900 XTX. The same was true for Kit Guru, for instance. But other reviewers like Hardware Unboxed found the 9070 XT to be 13% slower than the 7900 XTX, making it basically a 7900 7900 XT equivalent, which makes these cards unbuyable at their current prices. So which one is it? Well, the issue seems to be high frame rate games like Counter-Strike 2 and Valorant, for instance. Tech Power Up, in their review, did test Counter-Strike 2, and we could see that the 9070 XT is slower than even the 7900 XT, and therefore behind the regular 5070, which is a scam from Nvidia being effectively a baseline 5060. Kid Guru, on the other hand, did not test either Counter-Strike 2 or Valorant, or any esports games in fact, so that's why their relative overall performance puts the 9070 XT much closer to the 7900 XTX. When we look at hardware unboxed, we find games like Counter-Strike 2, where again, the 9070 XT is slower than the regular 5070, and War Thunder, where the 9070 XT is again slower than the 7900 XT and the regular 5070. And in DeBauer's review, we see Valorant, another high frame rate game, again significantly behind the regular 5070. So it seems the more esports titles that reach high frames are included in a review, the worse the 9070 XT becomes. This could be a driver issue, but the fact that we can observe this in multiple titles running in different engines could point to this being a throughput problem with the microarchitecture. And this could come from a variety of factors or a combination of them. It could be a bandwidth issue where the bandwidth of the memory system limits how many operations per second can actually be performed. However, I think the problem lies somewhere else. If you take a look at DeBauer's numbers, in Valorant, the 9070 XT is pulling 29% more power than the non-XT 9070 to achieve a mere 13% performance improvement, and is pulling as much power as a 5080. And in Counter-Strike 2, the 9070 XT is pulling 25% more power than the non-XT, while delivering only 8% more performance. So it seems to me that the reason these cards perform worse in high frame rate scenarios is because they are thermal throttling. I don't have one at the moment, so I can't test this extensively, but it seems like the likely cause. This tells us that, for one, if you play a lot of competitive shooters on a 240Hz monitor and want to squeeze as many pixels out as possible, then you're actually better off buying the horrible 5070 non-Ti than a 9070 or 9070 XT. And secondly, this harkens back to what AMD's executives said right after CES, with Frank Azor telling Tom'sHardware.com the following: "There's no way, with everything else we had to do at this show, that you would have left happy if we had included RDNA 4 in the keynote, and not just because of time, but the pricing perspective, performance review, FSR4 capabilities, architecture, and the incumbent is going to launch something later tonight. Why not wait and see what they're going to do? Whatever we do to respond would just benefit the market, so it's good for gamers." I think Frank should look up the meaning of the word incumbent. It doesn't mean market leader, if that's what he meant. But anyway, he continued, "Let's put together a recipe that's going to win. Positioning, performance, pricing, and the time that it deserves, and show people that we actually do care about gaming." In past videos, I've already gone through the fact that this is an admission that AMD isn't competing with Nvidia. They are just waiting for Nvidia to launch products and then price their own as high as they can get away with relative to what the market leader does. There's zero interest from AMD in disrupting the market, despite all this propaganda. But notice how Frank kept mentioning performance and not just pricing when he talked about what they would do as a response to the 5070 and 5070 Ti announcements. Also note that before CES, the leaks that were around had the 9070 XT at roughly the 7800 XT level, but now they will launch much closer to the 7900 XTX. Well, except when the cards have to go beyond 200 FPS, especially at 4K, which is when the thermal throttling seems to kick in. Given all this, I think what happened, and this is an informed guess without having the card or insider information on this, but I think that after they saw what Nvidia was launching at CES, then AMD last minute made the call to increase the power draw of these cards beyond spec and implement a throttling point so that the cards appear better at single-player AAA games, which typically make the bulk of testing in reviews, but that hinder the cards at competitive shooters and esports games in general. If we look at AMD's own reviewer's guide, which I'm not allowed to show publicly as I'm under NDA for it, even though I'm not reviewing the cards, we see that at 4K there's not a single esports title tested. It's also somewhat strange that the 9070 XT has a theoretical FP32 maximum of 48.66 teraflops, while the 5070 Ti is significantly less at 43.94 teraflops, but the 5070 Ti is on average almost 10% faster than the 9070 XT in most reviews. And if we were to test competitive shooters like Counter-Strike 2 and Valorant and War Thunder, etc. only, I think the 5070 Ti would be consistently 50% faster than the 9070 XT while having this lower theoretical throughput. Now, one could argue that AMD made the executive decision of throwing efficiency out the window in favor of better performance in AAA games because esports games already run at fast enough frame rates to provide a good gaming experience, and that there's no discernible difference at such high frame rates. And I think those are valid points. The reason I'm bringing this issue with high frame rate titles up is because of how AMD positioned these cards on the lead up to this launch. Remember Jack Huyon's interview last year? Speaking to Tom's Hardware back in September of last year, he stated that, and I'm quoting from the article, AMD wants to drive broader user adoption to convince developers to focus on Radeon products. And he also stated that, my number one priority right now is to build scale, to get us to 40 to 50% of the market faster. Do I want to go after 10% of the TAM or 80%? I'm an 80% kind of guy because I don't want AMD to be the company that only people who can afford Porsches and Ferraris can buy. I want to build the best products at the right system price point. So think about price point wise, we'll have leadership. Right, that 80% of TAM are the people who bought $300 to $350 cards, not $650 cards as we'll see. And looking at the top 20 most played games on Steam right now, Counter-Strike 2 is number 1 by a wide margin, a game that AMD themselves excluded from their own reviewer's guide numbers. Then PUBG in 3rd place, Apex Legends is at number 10, and Delta Force at 14 for example. All games where people either want a card that can push as many pixels as possible because they want to have a competitive edge, at least in their minds, or games where people want to spend the bare minimum to get playable frame rates, which is why the 4060 is now the most used card in the Steam hardware survey, with the 3060 in 2nd place. The 3060 launched at $329 and the 4060 at $299. By the way, the 7000 series cards from AMD, all of them combined, have less than 0.5% representation. So what Jack Huyon is saying is that they want to pivot and address that crowd that either buys the 60 class card from Nvidia at around $300 for the bare minimum playable experience all-rounder, or those who want to have a competitive edge and jump up a tier and stretch to around $500 to push as many pixels out as they can. But are these 9000 cards in line with this pivot in AMD's strategy that Huyon is claiming? Firstly, the 9070 XT costs well over what the supposed target audience, that 80% TAM, is looking for, which is in the $300 to $350 range. And secondly, these 9070 cards don't meet the criteria of that portion of the 80% TAM that AMD executives said they are targeting, that want a card that can push very high frame rates. That's what this 80% of TAM is, those two groups. Where does that 80% TAM fit into what the 9070 and 9070 XT are offering? There's a complete disconnect between what AMD's executives Frank Azor, Jack Huyon, and David McAfee said in the lead-up to the RDNA 4 launch and the products that they have just released. The 9070 and 9070 XT are the opposite of what they said they would launch, especially when we consider that the effective MSRP of the 9070 XT is $650 once the initial batch of cards is gone. If you look at this slide from AMD's press materials from the 9070s, you see that AMD's internal data suggests that 85% of gamers buy GPUs under $700. Well, what they don't state is that looking at the Steam hardware survey, we see that 66% of all cards are less than $650. The 9070 XT falls outside of what the majority of gamers buy, and in fact, looking at cards under $400, you'll find 40% of the cards. So the 9070 and 9070 XT do not, in any way, fall into the strategy of addressing 80% of the TAM. Do you know what card is positioned exactly as the card that AMD described prior to launching these? Nvidia's horrible 5070. And the 5060, which I believe will be launching next month, will absolutely gobble up all the sales that AMD was looking for when Jack Huyen said he wanted to reach 40 to 50% of the market as quickly as possible. The 5060 will be an 80% TAM card. AMD's strategy makes even less sense when we look at how the previous generation, 7900 XT, was at several points for sale at $650 throughout last year. So re-releasing that card with ray tracing fixed at the same price, which is essentially what the 9070 XT is, adds very little to the market, if anything. It doesn't fit into the 80% TAM, and it doesn't offer anything that wasn't already available to gamers. One could argue that the 7900 XT launched at $900 and not $650, but $900 was always an absolutely ridiculous price for that card, which is why it didn't sell. If the point was to pivot to an 80% of TAM, why re-release the worst card from the previous generation? If anything, that's continuing the same strategy, one that did not work in the past. If you are someone who values FSR4 and the better ray tracing performance, and those things are enough for you to buy a 9070 XT, then fair enough. I'm not here to chastise people who want these cards to play games and have fun with. Go for it by all means. Just know that AMD could easily be selling you these cards for $400 to $500 if they truly wanted to follow the strategy that they've been publicly peddling, as the propaganda from the last 6 months or so attests to. Well, I'll tell you what the reality actually is, and what AMD isn't telling you. Over the recent earnings calls, AMD's leadership has consistently shown to be focusing more on high-margin products, while simultaneously abandoning lower-margin stuff. Ian Cutress, formerly a writer for the now-defunct Anantak, summarized it perfectly in his Substack recently, stating the following regarding AMD's margins. The $1.78 billion of non-GAAP net income for the quarter was up 42% year-over-year and 18% quarter-over-quarter, eclipsing AMD's overall revenue gains. This boost in margins and profitability has a lot to do with AMD's product mix, which is seeing AMD derive more and more of its revenue from high-margin products, while also undergoing a similar drop in low-margin products. You see, despite what AMD has publicly claimed about their discrete GPU strategy for gamers, they have figured out that it's too much of an uphill battle to actually follow that strategy of going after the 80% TAM, and what they are doing instead is chasing ever-growing margins. Selling the 9070 XT at something like $400 would indeed fit into the strategy that they claim they have set for this generation, and would result in a huge volume of sales, potentially resulting in a gradual shift in market share towards AMD. It would take several years of following this strategy of big volume at low margins to get to 40 or 50% of the market share, as Jack Huyen stated they are chasing, but as AMD has been saying in their earnings calls, and judging from the product segments they are actually focusing on, they do not want to follow that strategy. They would rather have an insignificant market share of discrete GPUs, but maintain those high margins that investors love to see. AMD are not going after 80% of the TAM, they are going after 50, 60, and eventually 70% margins. From Lisa Su's perspective, the only reason they continue to invest in R&D for GPU technology is Microsoft and Sony, who expect AMD to have something to show for themselves when time comes to release yet another console cycle. The last thing Microsoft and Sony want is to have to deal with Nvidia, as Jensen's margins would make consoles absolutely unfeasible. No one would buy a console for $1,000 or more, and that's what they would cost if Microsoft and Sony had to rely on Nvidia for the graphics stack. So AMD keep doing the absolute minimum to keep Microsoft and Sony interested, but then publicly promise to really be making an effort this time to get gamers to buy their GPUs reviews by focusing on 80% of TAM. The facts speak for themselves when we observe these fake MSRPs and AMD offering a $50 rebate to partners during the review cycle in order to appear to be making some effort to follow this supposed 80% TAM strategy, when in reality the MSRP was always going to be $650. And thanks to the blatant collusion between retailers and AMD wanting to raise margins to pander to investors every quarter, AMD's partners don't even have a choice but to sell these cards to retailers at $200 over what they should be. Additionally, remember that AMD isn't offering reference models directly from their website this time, as that would require actual effort in design, testing, and manufacturing, and they would actually have to sell the cards at $600 themselves, something they are not willing to do despite the public claims by these guys. Even RDNA 1 at the $500 mark had reference designs. Now, some people have argued that AMD has no choice but to sell these cards at $650 because of rising costs with manufacturing. After I publish this video, I will post a full breakdown of costs to manufacture a 9070 XT on my Patreon and Discord, both what it costs AMD but also their partners, and include margins all the way up to retail. So those of you who are on the Patreon will get a clear picture that AMD could easily sell the 9070 XT for around $450 with everyone making money, even if AMD's own margins had to drop to single digits, because that is how they would go after the 80% TAM. Of course, investors would absolutely hate that. Lisa Su's focus is pandering to investors, no more, no less. Jensen Huang, who has on numerous occasions made anti-consumer and anti-competitor moves, so trust me, I'm no fan of his, at least has the drive and the passion to make Nvidia the best company in the world. Love him or hate him, that's what he's going for. He's always pushing for more, having invested in AI well ahead of everyone else, and now investing in things like personal robots, even when those things went completely against what Nvidia's investors wanted. Lisa Su is the complete opposite. She has zero focus, drive, or passion in taking AMD well beyond just a second-tier chip provider and in maintaining the status quo. Lisa's only focus is in the investors and the next quarter. This is called short-sighted bad management and is reflected, unfortunately for us, in their mediocre product line, and most explicitly in the complete dissonance between what they publicly claim they are trying to do as a company and what they then turn around and tell investors in quarterly calls, and how they ultimately position their products in the market. And this is not beneficial to AMD in the long term, and as a consequence, AMD gamer fans keep getting less while paying more. Is the 9070 XT a horrible product? No, it's fine. Is it badly priced? In my opinion, yes. Would I buy a 9070 XT? Absolutely not. And from the reviews and all the data available, and considering it's unlikely we will ever see this card at $600, I wouldn't recommend you buy it either. But fundamentally, to an agnostic observer at least, this launch shows how broken AMD is as a company when it comes to consumer products, particularly GPUs. To AMD fans and to the more, shall I say, naive in the tech media, the 9070s will be lauded as a great launch from AMD. I'm keen to know your thoughts and especially what GPU you are planning to buy in the current market, if any. Comment below and be sure to subscribe while you're there. And this video was made possible by my awesome patrons. Join them for just a couple dollars per month and get exclusive access to the Cortex Discord server. Thanks for watching, and until the next one.